Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our Nutrition Labeling USDA versus FDA webinar today. I'm excited to have Molly Van Alst here with me hosting the webinar. I am Amy Knock, and I will be moderating today's session. Before we begin, I just wanted to let you know a little bit more about how the webinar will run. The webinar is being recorded, and the slides and recording will be available to you within 3 business days. A short Q&A session will follow the presentation today to answer any viewer-submitted questions that you may have. During the webinar, you can submit questions using the webinar sidebar menu. Select the Questions tab, type in your question, then hit the Enter key on your keyboard. Remember, you can submit questions anytime throughout the webinar. And that concludes my very brief introduction today. Molly, I will now pass it over to you.
Awesome, thank you, Amy. Let me go ahead and turn on my webcam quickly. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see me now. As Amy mentioned, my name is Molly Van Alst. I am the Analytical Services Manager for our Vitamin and Special Analyses group at the Nutrition Analysis Center in Des Moines. I know that's kind of a mouthful, so really and truly, one of the key functions of my role is to be an extensive and comprehensive resource for nutrition labeling and really hone in on the details of the regulations to not only assist our customer service team, but also our clients when they have questions. So obviously, you've all signed up for the webinar today, so you know that our topic is nutrition labeling versus USDA and FDA, which is something relatively untouched when it comes to separating out what are the different requirements of each. So I'm going to hopefully provide some guidance today that will be helpful to most. So, all right, let's go ahead. So today's agenda, obviously, I just went through the introduction, who I am. We're going to start by going over some agency acronyms, who are USDA, FSIS, and FDA, as well as go through a history of the division and where the split kind of really occurred in those regulated products. So we'll talk about, the different approaches that they take, as well as the implications of those approaches. And then obviously we'll get into our regulated products by agency, which I think is probably what most are looking for here. I'll talk about the product matrices that are regulated by each, as well as some nuances that happen. And the 2 major criteria for mixed food products that are really important, which I think will be most helpful to the group. And then finally, we'll get into our NLEA requirements and how the industry currently uses them today when it comes to USDA versus FDA. So we'll go over our label format differences, as well as the mandatory nutrient differences, and then essentially some options for different label types that you have. Okay, so agency acronyms. To start, if you're not familiar, FSIS, USDA stands for Food Safety Inspection Service, U.S. Department of Agriculture. They are different and do different things. However, for the purpose of this webinar, we're going to refer to them mostly as a synonym and operating under the same regulation. So you might see in some places they reference FSIS, in some places they reference USDA. For our purposes today, they're going to be the same. And FDA, probably most familiar, is the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. And obviously why we're all here today is they're both involved in nutrition labeling. And so we're going to go over the differences there. Both these agencies, it's important to know that they set their regulations based on what's called the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, or DGAs. These are published by the USDA and also the Department of Health and Human Services. But really and truly what these DGAs do is it's a collection of scientific research and things that this agency has discovered, and it provides a foundation for the FDA and FSIS regulations. So it gives them direction on how to regulate these products. A really good example is things like added sugars in the new label format. Those actually came from the DGAs, from research about added sugars that people are eating today. That's not something that the FDA just came up with on their own. It came from historical scientific research provided by the DGAs. And it's also worth mentioning, I don't have it listed up here, but the National Academy of Medicine, so they're basically an objective third party, very high quality research organization. And they also helped establish thresholds for things like vitamins and minerals. So you're talking about your reference daily intakes and your DRVs, things of that nature. And finally, on this slide, I have provided a few regulatory resources that you can look through after this presentation. Most of what I'm going to talk about today is present in these links. However, if you've ever looked at these, it can be pretty daunting to go through them. So hopefully this presentation will be a good quick guide for everyone. And Amy, if you wouldn't mind, go ahead and putting up the first poll question before we get
Sure. Wonderful. I just put it up for everyone, and we'll give everybody a little bit of time to respond to that one. Just give it a few more moments here. All right. Okay, and then I will share out the results. And Molly, can you see those results? Otherwise, I can read those off for you.
I cannot actually see them.
Okay, and I believe that the viewers can. So again, about 52% of our respondents said yes, and about 48% said no.
Okay, awesome. So a pretty even split. So hopefully for the 48%, this will be a lot of new helpful information. And hopefully for those who are somewhat familiar, you'll find some tidbits in here that are still helpful as well. Okay, so history, you can see there I have the division in parentheses, and that's really because FSIS, USDA, and FDA really and truly, they do work together. They did previously and still do today work together hand in hand. So together, many of their regulations actually overlap and intertwine. So that's important to keep in mind when you're looking at the regulations. As for the 1906 Meat Inspection Act and Pure Food and Drugs Act, these are the points in history which really start to change the industry. So this was kind of prompted by the jungle. All of the changes in food regulations happened around the time that Upton Sinclair put this book out in 1905. If you haven't read the book or aren't really familiar with it, what it did was it really stimulated controversy and discussion about relevant problems related to food safety and product identity at that time. So a really common example that people might be familiar with is formaldehyde in milk. At that time, Upton Sinclair really called attention to and stressed the need that we need to have to protect consumers from adulterated or misbranded food. So that book in 1905 eventually fueled the fire for these two acts, the 1906 Meat Inspection Act and Pure Food and Drugs Act. The Meat Inspection Act essentially banned sale of adulterated or misbranded livestock and related products, and the Pure Food and Drugs Act banned the sale of misbranded or adulterated food and drugs in interstate commerce. So it's important, though, these two acts, the approach that was taken was much different. So Congress took these acts much differently and designated them to two different agencies. And that's where many people don't understand why these agencies do what they do, because the Meat Inspection Act, Congress first decided that, okay, meat products, then poultry, then processed eggs and catfish, they're really and truly just different products that deserve a different approach to inspection and labeling. So then as things kind of got more developed, in the same way, the Pure Foods and Drug Act required a different way of approaching these foods under the FDA jurisdiction, and really paved the way for what is now called the FDA, but then was called the Bureau of Chemistry. So fun fact, the FDA was actually renamed as FDA around 1930, I believe. It was actually first a division of the USDA, and it was called the Bureau of Chemistry. So as you'll learn in the next couple of slides, due to the requirements of each of these acts, both the agencies actually have similar authority and power, but they have opposite approaches. So FSIS USDA, again, I mentioned the 1906 Meat Inspection Act. Congress designated USDA to implement this into the law by establishing various regulations and programs. So the important takeaway from this is that what they came up with resulted in a pre-market approval design for regulating foods under FSIS. So what that means is basically any aspect of your daily operations, the design of your facility, your food safety programs, think HACCP, including food labeling. These are all subject to be reviewed and approved by FSIS USDA before you can actually produce them and sell them into commerce. So they rely on these very detailed regulations, and they just kind of to give you a frame of reference, they review and approve about 35,000 labels per year. Something that is also important is that they have the immediate authority and ability to take a label out from being used. So essentially, you know, they may see something in the plant, they may see something later on in the process, and they have the ability to take that label out from use, and thus you cannot produce the product. It's kind of a funny example, but a way of looking at it, you know, different from FDA, and I'm not recommending that you do this with an FDA product, but with FSIS USDA, you can't really open up, you know, a meat processing business in your basement or in your house. You have to go through a series of processes to manufacture and sell this product safely. So FDA, the 1906 Pure Foods Act, Congress designated FDA to implement this into the law by, again, establishing certain regulations, policies, and programs. And this is the key difference from FSIS, where their structure resulted in a post-market surveillance design for regulating foods and beverages that fall under the FDA. So you might ask, well, if they're looking for these things after it's already in the market, it already has a nutrition facts panel, we've already done several production runs, how do they find non-compliances? Well, simply put, it's when they suspect or know that a product is misbranded. Okay, well, how do they suspect or know that? There's various different ways. Competitors, so competitor product may, you know, take issue with something on a label and you let the FDA know and say, hey, you should look into this. So they may start looking into it that way. The FDA also does what's called total diet studies every year, where they essentially go to the supermarket or wherever and they buy products and they test it and make sure it's true to the label. And then, you know, there's kind of a more informal, which I'm sure at some point has happened, you know, maybe an FDA employee is at the grocery store, or, you know, they buy something online and they take issue with the labeling or processing. So there's several different ways, but the key thing to remember is that it all happens after the product has gone to market. And so in this fashion too, because it's already in the market, FDA, they don't have the ability to just immediately rescind a label. They actually have to go through a legal process to get that removed from the market and take it to the courts. So in general, they're not going to pre-approve any labels. Of course, if you're filing some sort of exemption firsthand, they may do that for you. Okay, so what are the implications of these different approaches? Well, FSIS has this pre-approval process, right? We've already talked about that. So no product goes on the market without USDA's approval. But they can't keep a product that is safe and labeled accurately out of the market. So that really forces FSIS USDA to make an immediate decision. Thus, it's kind of provides them greater flexibility, or companies that are producing these products greater flexibility, because if their product's accurately labeled and safe, the FSIS is going to have to make a decision and let you run that product. They also have an expansive range of informal policies that they use, which helps them stay up to date on current technology and industry advances. And again, because of their pre-market role, and it's heavily involved, they are usually more aware of what the new industry advances. They also have a lot of resources available to them. So they have food standards and labeling policy book, they have their compliance policy guides, and they even have directives for their inspectors. So if you're operating a USDA plant, you have someone there from USDA who is supervising your production process the entire time. Without that person there, you can't run. So it really is a very heavily involved pre-market approach. So it kind of on the contrary, the implications of FDA's approach is their regulations, they're seemingly fluid, and they often are kind of unclear and really vague. So they rely on these somewhat fluid regulations and, as I've mentioned before, post-market surveillance. So many times criteria might be vague or even not well known. Really good examples for this are, single ingredient sugars, or the additional guidances that they had to put out to define dietary fiber with the new 2016 definition. It's a good example of how it's kind of a revise, refine, hit and miss type scenario, where things happen after the market and kind of get tweaked a little bit. So I've mentioned they take action based on suspicion after products are in the market. The consequences of this is sometimes you're going to see inconsistencies in similar products. There may be, a product that is almost exactly the same as something else, and if maybe one manufacturer is aware of the regulations and the other isn't, the consumer is going to get confused. So you can see some inconsistencies there. Corrective actions, so it takes time to get through regulatory due process and legal means, the courts, for corrective actions and getting a label removed from use. So that is one of the key differences with FSIS, and it's also why it's really important for manufacturers to be familiar with labeling regulations so that they don't face the consequences from FDA action. And then again, contrary to the FSIS, FDA is not always privy to industry advances because they operate post-market. So this can actually really pose a lot of labeling challenges for manufacturers and the analytical labs like Eurofins who are testing these. An example is protein factors, and this is something that affects my day-to-day when it comes to nutrition labeling. So if you're not familiar, the FDA in their CFR says proteins calculated by quantifying nitrogen, and you apply a factor of 6.25 to convert to protein, okay? There's a few exceptions like dairy and certain grains that they've called out that use different factors, but for the majority of products, you use a 6.25 factor. The problem is, with all these industry advances and these new products in the market, all these health trends with isolated ingredients and highly processed ingredients, some of these most don't fit this standard 6.25 factor that the FDA has mandated. And that's going to either one, falsely inflate, or two, deflate your protein value if that's not the correct factor. So where this really becomes problematic is when the value is specifically inflated. So one, you're declaring more protein than you actually have. And two, your protein is a direct, it's used directly in the calculation for carbohydrates. So that means if your protein is higher, your carbs are automatically going to be lower. And that presents the opportunity for other complications. So dietary fiber plus sugar could be greater than your carbohydrate value because it's lower because your protein's higher. And that's going to be contradictory to what the consumer expects and what we've been told. So I've provided an example there of where this has occurred. You can see your sugars and dietary fiber are greater than the total carbohydrate value. And so again, this is a true testament to the FDA maybe not always being up to date on certain things. There are arguably more scientific approaches of determining protein factor, which just currently isn't written in the CFR that way. So scope of authority, I thought it might be worth mentioning interstate commerce. So the regulations that I've just talked about, they reflect a national scope, but individual states, products for human or animal food are accurately labeled in interstate commerce. This presents the option for individual states to basically make up their own regulations or add to the regulations, but most of them are going to mimic federal requirements. There's a handful of states that create and operate under their own regulations, and they may have more enhanced requirements for nutritional labeling, but the key here is with interstate commerce. So they can't block somebody from selling a product from another state. So if you produce a product in one state and it's only sold in that specific state, it is subject to that aforementioned state's rules. However, if this state is Kansas and Illinois wants to send a product to be sold in Kansas, and let's say they are calling it organic, well, if it doesn't meet Kansas's definition of organic, they still can't say, well, you can't sell your product in this state. They still have to allow it. So you may even see some variations in certain definitions that way of products sold in the same state on the same shelf. All right, so kind of to get into the regulated products by agency, I think, again, this is really what people are looking for. Hopefully this will give you a good key. We're talking about FDA regulated products first. So food products, really a good chunk of products are going to fall under this category, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in the next couple of slides. But food products does also include seafood, shelled eggs, so your eggs that are just, from the chicken in the shell in a carton, and your exotic animal species products. These do not include meat, poultry, processed egg products, and catfish, which are actually FSIS, USDA regulated. And again, I will touch on that in a minute. So FDA covers food products, bottled water, dietary supplements, food additives, and infant formula. Something that's really important here is if you have an FDA regulated product, and let's say you're adding a meat component, or it's like a flavored to mimic meat products, you cannot characterize it as a standard meat product. You have to say flavored. So it cannot be a chicken product, it is a chicken flavored product. And we'll go through some examples as well. USDA FSIS regulated products, as I mentioned briefly on the last slide, those are meat, so red meat, poultry, processed egg products. This one's interesting. So there are some important exceptions here. When you're thinking processed egg products, that's going to be like dried or freeze-dried powdered eggs, or your liquid egg products that are not in the shell anymore. Those are FSIS USDA regulated. However, the moment that you add something or an ingredient to enhance the appearance of that egg product, it now falls under FDA jurisdiction, which is confusing, right? But a good example is egg beaters. So egg beaters is a processed egg product, but it's actually under FDA. And why? Because oftentimes, those producers may be adding some sort of, I don't know, yellow food coloring or an ingredient to kind of maintain consistency for texture or viscosity. So they're adding something to enhance that appearance, and it's now, boom, an FDA regulated product. Catfish is another weird one. Not super great reasoning that I'm aware of. However, I do know that it was called out by the Farm Bills of 2008 and 2014. The gist of what I get is that those who were involved in creating these regulations and involved in the catfish industry basically said, we think these should have a more robust labeling and processing, requirements. So we want to include these with FSIS, and so they're included with FSIS. So the other seafood, FDA, catfish is USDA, FSIS. And then, so we'll get into the two major criteria for labeling mixed food products. This is, I mentioned on the last slide, a lot of food products that have some, meat component or something that would be USDA regulated included in it. So we'll kind of go over, how you determine based on these two criteria where it falls. And before I go to that, Amy, if you wouldn't mind displaying the next poll question.
Sure, I will go ahead and launch that and give everyone just about 30 seconds here to respond to it. It looks like we're getting a much larger percentage of no's here. I'll just give it a few more moments before we display the results. All right, so looking at the results here, we have about 36% of respondents said yes, and 64% said no.
Okay, great, awesome. That gives me a little more room to teach you guys something new. So we'll go back to our presentation here. Perfect, okay. So the two major criteria, the first being foods, this is the one that most are going to use. So foods made with either 2% or more cooked meat or poultry, or 3% or more raw meat or poultry. This is very important at the point of formulation. So this is before the product gets cooked or processed into the finished product. So at the point of formulation, if it has 2% or more cooked, 3% or more raw, it is supposed to be under USDA FSIS. A good example to kind of walk you through here is pizza. So think cheese pizza, no meat, just a plain cheese pizza. That's actually going to be under your FDA regulations, and you would label it as a cheese pizza. Now, using those thresholds above with the cooked example, so let's say now you have a cheese pizza with cooked pepperoni that's only 1.8% of that entire product formula. It's under that 2% threshold, so it's going to be under FDA, and it's going to be called a pepperoni flavored pizza. Yes, I did say pepperoni flavored pizza. So now you have a cheese pizza with cooked pepperoni that is 4%. So now you're over that 2% threshold. 4% pepperoni at formulation. That product is actually now FSIS USDA regulated and needs to bear their nutrition facts panel, and it's called a pepperoni pizza. So you might look at this a little funny. It makes you cringe a little bit. You're probably thinking, well, I've never gone to the supermarket and seen something called a pepperoni flavored pizza, so what's the point? Well, a lot of these larger manufacturers or people who have been doing this, they probably formulate at the point so that it is 2% or more pepperoni, and it can be called a pepperoni pizza. But it is important to note, these are things you need to pay attention to when it comes to your formulation, because it could change what entity you need to label with. So And I know that was a cooked example, but it is very similar for raw. So if you think a chicken nugget, let's say you're making a chicken nugget product that's got raw chicken and it has 2.8%. So below that, or yes, below that 3% of raw meat, that would be under FDA and it would be called a chicken flavored nugget. Let's say, it's got 2.8% chicken and some other plant-based material that you're using, it's actually a chicken flavored nugget. Now, if it has 3% or more of that raw chicken, then it's under FSIS and it's a chicken nugget. So similar. So the second criteria, if you didn't cringe before, this one will probably make you cringe a little bit. And it's probably one that most aren't familiar with. So products which historically have been considered by consumers to be products other than meat, poultry, can be exempted from FSIS labeling. In layman's, this really just means if you can prove that a long time ago consumers regarded something as not a meat or poultry product that's under FSIS, then you can label it under FDA. A really good example of this is corn dogs, which are actually under FSIS, and bagel dogs, which are actually under FDA. And the reason for that is one of the states actually challenged USDA with recipe books and menus from like over 50 years ago. And those recipe books showed that bakeries and cafes were selling bagel dogs, and it showed that the ingredients were composed of just hot dogs and bagel dough. So of course, FSIS had to allow them an exemption, and bagel dogs are now under FDA and can be labeled with FDA regulation. So it's a little funky. And again, another testament to why you should have a decent understanding of what products are regulated under which agency. This one really speaks to amenability. So, I mean, how well can you argue or prove that your product belongs under a different regulation is really going to be where you're going to see these differences. So the next slide I'll kind of briefly go through, but I thought this to be more of an after the presentation resource for those who would like a nice little cheat sheet of what products are regulated under which agency. You can see there for USDA, it's domestic animals, so your chicken and turkey, and then ratites, so that's going to be like ostrich or emu, your cattle, sheep, swine, goats, and then as I mentioned, your processed egg products, with the exception of those that have that physical or appearance enhancement, like your egg beaters. And then we went over the rules for those mixed meat products that have different percentage thresholds. For FDA, it's going to be more wild and non-specific, so they regulate wild turkeys, duck, and geese, as well as bison, rabbits, deer, and other game animals. And then the shell eggs. So again, I mentioned, I believe at the very beginning, the eggs comes out of the chicken, goes into your carton. Those are FDA regulated. And then I did put the note there below that catfish are under FSIS. So finally, we will go through our NLEA requirements and where the industry kind of stands today. And so if you're labeling with USDA or labeling with FDA, I'll go over what the requirements are for you and what your nutrition facts panel should look like. So we're really transitioning now to what is different about the actual physical panel and testing components rather than the difference in the regulated products. So if you weren't aware, NLEA is the Nutrition Labeling and Education Act of 1990. Also, we had some regulations recently revised in 2016. It was really intended to be a complement or like an adjunct to the Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act, but it did tell FDA that they had to take action with these products, but it interestingly enough did not tell FSIS to do anything. So FDA was required to participate in this, but FSIS was not. However, both agencies do, and they did get together to discuss these, and they kind of jointly worked on these types of things for consistency's sake. And you'll notice because FSIS has actually proposed new rules that mimic FDA's updated rules. So those will be coming, whenever they decide to implement those. Really and truly, the holdup, I think, is the serving size and adjustments to the racks. So when FDA made their changes in 2016, they had done a lot of work to update the rack, the reference amounts that are customarily consumed for serving sizes, and USDA just hasn't done that work yet. So that's probably what the holdup is. So what does NLEA do? What did FDA essentially have to do with NLEA? It outlines and defines the required nutrients that you have to list on a panel. And then it also establishes reference amounts for determining serving sizes, as I kind of mentioned. And then it does require a nutrition facts panel on most foods, with some exceptions. So things to think about are foods that have insignificant nutrients. I think it says 8 or more. You can use an abbreviated panel, and some foods like common fruits or vegetables don't need to bear this, as long as the information is available to the consumer. And then products, things with really small packages, so limited package space. Obviously, you're not going to have much room to bear a nutrition facts panel. So there are some exceptions there when it comes to whether or not you have to have an NFP. So formatting changes, I took this straight from the FDA. You can go find these same images from their website. They are commonly used everywhere, and probably because they do show pretty well a side-by-side comparison of what the differences are. So you can see the original label, which is the 1990 NLEA, which is also what the USDA format still looks like. So if you're labeling with USDA, your format looks like this first original label. If you're labeling FDA, you're not required to use this new format, which is, you can see several different changes there. So there's your servings are larger and bolder. Your calories have a much larger presence. The FDA really wants, the consumer to be aware of how many calories they're consuming, as well as how many servings are in a container. And then you also see you have your added sugars indentation there, as well as they've got some updated daily values. And then one of the bigger changes too is there's a change in required nutrients. So previously, you'll notice on the original label there, vitamin A and C are listed. Well, now it's vitamin D and potassium. So really where that change came from was, again, going back to the DGAs, the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. They looked at what people are eating today, and back in 1990, we were more deficient in vitamin A and C, and with our diets and lifestyles today, that's not as much of a concern, and we're more deficient in vitamin D and potassium. So that's the reason that you see those nutrients swapped out there. Again, though, if you are labeling under USDA, you're actually still labeling vitamin A and C because they haven't implemented their new regulations yet. Okay, so I'll go over the macronutrients that are required for these agencies. You can see I've got a table there that M on stands for mandatory and V is voluntary. So you can see a nice comparison there of what you need to have on your USDA versus FDA facts panel. Some things, other voluntary nutrients, many may not know unless you primarily produce FSIS products, but stearic acid can actually be included as a voluntary nutrient on your FSIS label. You probably won't see it in the market because it's unique to meat, so usually people aren't going to declare it, but it is an option. You can also declare calories from saturated fat, other types of carbohydrates, and soluble and insoluble fiber. The soluble and insoluble fiber, you're probably going to see more of now on a nutrition facts panel with FDA 2016 formats. And that's really because all of the changes surrounding the FDA's definition of dietary fiber, it's being more scrutinized. People are really trying to have as much information as possible. So you may start to see that appear on your nutrition facts panels. So similarly, I've got the micronutrients. Again, I've got a nice little table there for you. There aren't as many that are mandatory for both agencies. But like I mentioned, the difference really is your vitamin A and C versus D and potassium. There are several other voluntary nutrients that you can list on your nutrition facts panel if you'd like. Obviously, this is being that they are present in the product, or you're fortifying the product with these vitamins or minerals. That being said, if you're doing such, you need to be aware of the special considerations for these. So A, D, E, B3, which is niacin, and B9, which is folate. There are special conversions and reporting units that you need to use on your nutrition facts panel, such as RAE and niacin equivalent. So if you're not familiar with those, definitely check out the FDA website. They have a really good guidance for how to appropriately convert the values that you have and what should be displayed on your panel. Minerals, a little bit easier. You've got a handful there that can be listed as voluntary if they are added to your product. And then finally, I just wanted to provide everyone with a quick guidance for all of the required components on a nutrition panel. So USDA uses 9 CFR, FDA uses 21 CFR. I provided the specific references there if you're interested in learning more about the other components besides what we discussed today, which is the orange area nutrition facts. So those are excellent resources if you have questions or if you would like to look further into the nutrition facts information. I definitely did not cover everything. So all of that information is listed there. And with that, I just want to say thank you to everyone for joining. Again, my name is Molly Van Alst. I've got my email address there in case anybody wants to reach out with questions, but Amy will also, I'm sure, provide some information. And then Amy, I don't know if you'd like to maybe kick it off with some questions.
Yes, that sounds great. Thank you again for your presentation, Molly. And I know we have been receiving numerous questions in the chat, and I know some people may have joined later, but just to remind you, yes, you will receive a copy of the presentation as well as the recording. But it looks like we have some interesting questions coming in here. The first one, Molly, being, what if I have an FSIS USDA regulated product, but I want to use the new label format that the FDA uses?
Okay, that's a really good question. So I've mentioned previously that although FSIS has not instituted new or updated their new regulations, they do say that you can use, if you have an FSIS regulated product, USDA regulated product, you can actually switch to the new updated format that bears vitamin D, potassium, all that good stuff, so long as you adhere to FDA's requirements. And the reason that they're really comfortable with that is because, as I mentioned, they have some draft guidances and they really parallel what FDA has already put out. So that is an option. If you want to use the new format and you have an FSIS product, you can certainly do so, but you must conform to all of FDA's requirements. So just make sure that you're diligent about that. So good question.
Great, thank you. Moving into another question here. If I want the FDA to review my label before I use it on my product, would I submit a request similar to the USDA?
Yes, so that's another good question. Unfortunately, from what I've learned, FDA really and truly does not review or approve labels. If you send them something to review, you're very likely not going to get a response. I think the exception there would be if you're, you're trying to make some sort of health claim that requires pre-approval anyway from the FDA, or if you're filing for some sort of exemption. Let's say you're adding a fiber that's not recognized, and you want to ensure that that's included in your dietary fiber value. Then I assume the FDA, and I don't know this, but I assume they would probably look at your panel. But in general, if you ask them to review, they're not going to do that. USDA, FSIS, on the other hand, they require it. So almost a little bit more of a benefit there.
Great, thank you. And we've received a lot of other really good questions. So we'll take some now, but in case we don't get to all these, we will follow up. But the next question that has come in, does trans have to be in italics? This person said they've heard it argued both ways.
From what I understand, it does have to be in italics. And the only reason I am inclined to say that is because if you look at the CFR and guidance documents that the FDA puts out, the majority of what I've seen is in their text, they italicize it themselves. So it's not a clear answer for you, but I'm happy to look into that question further and see if I can find any more specific information. But my recommendation would be to default to italicizing that.
Great, thank you, Molly. And then the next question here, what percentage of an allergen ingredient has to be declared and what is minimum value?
I believe that, so if I understand the question correctly, I believe that's going to be dependent on specific allergens, so they may be different, which I'm sure the FDA has some resources out there. Again, something I can look into and provide to the question asker after this presentation, but I believe it's going to be dependent on certain allergens, what that threshold is.
Great, thank you. And I think we have time for about two more questions here, two or three more. So the next one that came in, does the unit for the serving size on a panel need to be spaced or not? For example, is it 5 grams or 5 space grams?
Okay, that's a good question.
Yeah.
Yeah, so our default, if I can take a look after this too, I believe our program, our software program that we use defaults to what's automatically correct. If you're referring to the quantitative serving size, which is within the parentheses, I believe that they do not have a space they place. So if it was 55 grams, it would be 55 grams in the parentheses. Outside of that, so where your common household measure is listed, usually, I mean, that has a space because you're usually using things like, 1 bottle or 1 cup. But inside the parentheses, I believe it is supposed to be next to each other, no space.
Wonderful, thank you. And I think we'll do one more question here. And as I mentioned, in case we did not get to all of these, we will follow up. But the last one that came in, what percentage of meat ingredient in a product makes it USDA jurisdiction?
So again, that one, it'll depend on whether it's cooked or raw. So if you have 2% cooked of the meat product in your product or 3% or more raw, that would require it to be an FSIS regulated product. So for that question, I have on one of the slides those criteria outlined that could be saved as a reference because it is a little bit confusing. But for the cooked product, it's going to be 2%. For the raw, it's going to be 3%. And if it's under that, it is FDA regulated.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And again, I think we'll close out the Q&A portion here. That wraps it up at this time. And then again, I want to remind everyone that recording as well as a copy of the slides will be available in 3 business days. And when you do close out the webinar today, I'd invite you to just answer those 3 questions that we have for you. Again, one of them being if you would like someone to follow up with you from Eurofins, but in case we want to follow up on any of those other questions in more detail, we have all that contact information. And again, I want to thank you, Molly, for your presentation today. Very, very informative. And thanks again to everyone for attending. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.